Welcome to another edition of Comfortable Words. Comfortable Words is a series of short videos on a topic of interest to the parish of St. Olave's, Swansea, here in Toronto. Today I'm going to be speaking about the history of our parish. Much of what I have to say today can be found in a book called The First Century, St. Olave's Anglican Church, Swansea, 1886 to 1986. This book was published by our parish on our 100th anniversary, and copies of it can be purchased from the parish office for a very reasonable fee. Our parish consists of all the land that once formed the independent village of Swansea, running from Bloor Street in the north to Lake Ontario in the south, and from the Humber River in the west to High Park in the east. Swansea was annexed by the city of Toronto in 1967, but the area continues to have a village feel about it, even to this day. I think this stems in part from the fact that we are self-contained as a community. A very large river on the west, an enormous lake on the south, and a massive urban park on the east, all means that we have very few ways into Swansea from the rest of the city. Those of us who live here like this small town atmosphere, and we take pride in our community as remaining somewhat distinct from the rest of the city of Toronto. Humans have lived and worked and traveled over this land for 10,000 years and probably much more. The Toronto Carrying Place was an indigenous trail that led from the mouth of the Humber River on Lake Ontario, all the way up to the Holland River near Lake Simcoe. The trail was a part of a network of trade routes throughout the region. At the time that Europeans first discovered the route, it was being used by the Wendat, Onondaga, and later the Mississauga First Nations. Etienne Brulé is said to have been the first white man to travel the trail and to see Lake Ontario in 1615. Post-contact, the trail continued to be used by European missionaries, adventurers, and business people right up until the early 1800s, including Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, who traveled the trail in 1793. The area was only slowly populated, first by the French and later by English settlers and those from other parts of Canada. The history of St. Olave's could be said to have its genesis in the 1830s when two prominent men moved into the area. First, in 1837, John Howard purchased land and built Colborne Lodge in what is now High Park. 2 years later, his friend John Ellis bought Grenadier Pond and 165 acres of land to the west. These two men would be important figures in both the history of the area and also in the founding and the growth of St. Olave's. Their lands would eventually form High Park. Throughout much of the 1800s, the area was actually known as Windermere, and it remained sparsely populated and rural. But the area would receive a boost when, in 1882, the Bolt Works was founded. Situated at the bottom of Windermere Avenue and the Queensway, the manufacturing plant would be a major economic driver and employer, helping grow the area's population. The company produced bolts, fasteners, rivets, and nuts. Incidentally, in 1910, the company would merge with 4 other Canadian steelworks to form Stelco, the Steel Company of Canada, and the company continued to operate in the area right up until 1990. As the population grew, the need for a church to serve the Anglicans of the area became increasingly dire. In 1886, the parish of St. Anne's Gladstone decided they would start a mission church for the area. And in July of that same year, the first service was held in the boardroom of the Bolt Works. The priest in charge was the Reverend Softley. It didn't take long for the new congregation to raise funds for a building, and by September of 1887, the first service was held in the first St. Olave's Church building. This new building was originally called St. Olave's by the Lake, but eventually that suffix was dropped. This first St. Olave's was a lovely and simple country church. It could very well have been designed by John Howard, who was an architect and who was responsible for several buildings in Toronto. The building was immortalized by A.J. Casson, a group of 7 painter, in a painting called Old Church, Swansea. It was situated near the bottom end of Windermere. Today, a small apartment building stands on the site. There are only 2 items that remain from this original church, including the steeple cross that is now affixed to the front of our church building, and the altar grading or altar ledge, which was only recently restored and reinstalled on our current altar. There was also a parish hall that was a separate building, located a short walk north of the church. This parish hall was eventually sold to raise money for the new church, and the building was moved 1 lot north and turned sideways to become a semi-detached house. The first few decades of St. Olave's were challenging. In 1891, the bolt works failed, and the economy of the area was in decline. The mission church struggled to stay open. In 1894, Reverend Softley left the parish, and the Anglicans of the village had no permanent vicar for the next 12 years. It's sobering to think how easily the history of our parish could have ended so early if it had not been for the foresight and determination of those who pushed through those dark years and kept the church going in spite of the challenges. But the dark years would not last forever, and the history of St. Olave's begins a new chapter in 1906 with the arrival of the Reverend H.H. Sparks. The altar in this chapel is dedicated in his honor. A graduate of Wycliffe College, Reverend Sparks would inaugurate a long-standing connection between the parish and the college that continues to this day. In 1909, only a few years after his arrival, St. Olave's was financially stable enough to become an independent parish, no longer considered a mission of St. Anne's. Reverend Sparks became the first of only 6 rectors of this parish right up until the present day. Between 1914 and 1918, Reverend Sparks served as a chaplain with the Canadian Expeditionary Force overseas, and the existing photos of him show him proudly wearing his uniform. As Swansea and Toronto continued to grow in the early 20th century, it became increasingly apparent that the future economic hub of the village was moving north towards Bloor Street. It was determined that the parish should seek new land on which to build a new church that would be more prominently located in the now reconfiguring village. In 1922, with the help of the rector's wife, Jessie, land was purchased near Bloor and Windermere. It seems as though the war may have taken a toll on Reverend Sparks, and not much progress on the building was made in his final years in the parish. Our second rector, Sextus Stiles, arrived in 1925. The window depicting John the Baptist baptizing Jesus was dedicated in his memory. As a relatively young and energetic man, he made the building project a top priority. But his will to build would not go unchallenged. Oddly, the land that was purchased for the new church came with some restrictions that precluded the building of a church on the property. The village council refused to make a concession, forcing the parish to take the issue all the way to the Superior Court of Ontario, which ruled in the favor of the parish. It should also be mentioned here that one of our neighboring Anglican parishes, St. Paul's Runnymede, protested the building of a new church so close to their own parish boundaries. But once again, diocesan authorities ruled in the favor of St. Olave's, and by 1926, a sod-turning ceremony was held, and by 1927, a new church basement was dedicated. Services would be held in the basement church for the next 10 years, while efforts were made to raise enough money to complete the building. In 1932, the parish received one of its most cherished treasures. The parish of St. Olave's in London, England, was, so it was thought at the time, to be closed. And it was arranged by interested parties that their beautiful baptismal font would be given new life here in Toronto at the parish that shared its name. St. Olave's London is one of only a handful of medieval city churches that escaped the Great Fire of London in 1666. Renowned Gothic revival architect Sir George Gilbert Scott restored and repaired this 15th century church in 1863, including the design of the new font, which he designed here. This stone font was made with a stone that comes from France. It's a creamy yellow Jurassic limestone quarried in northwestern France. Lord Wakefield, a parishioner of the London Church and the Lord Mayor of London, saw that the font was safely shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, all fees prepaid. In October of 1936, the cornerstone of the new church here in Toronto was laid. It can still be seen behind the bushes near the front entrance. By 1937, the main church was complete and dedicated by Archbishop Owen, who was the Primate of Canada at the time. A few changes were made in those early years, including the addition of the chapel and the installation of some beautiful stained glass windows, many of which were designed by Yvonne Williams. The result of the foresight and efforts of these early decades is a beautiful church that we continue to take great pride in more than 80 years later. The Gothic arches and the soaring ceilings lift our hearts towards God. By the time the parish prepared to welcome its third rector, Versey Wigmore, affectionately known as Versey, in 1955, they had never owned a rectory. All the former clergy had either owned or rented their own accommodation. And so the parish purchased for a mere $21,000 its first rectory, 8 Mossam Place. It is a handsome house located west of the church by about 10 minutes walking. Over the next 60 years, this rectory would be the home of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th rectors and their families, including Reg Rose and David Burrows. In 2016, the rectory at 8 Mossam Place was sold, and the proceeds were used to purchase a new rectory located on Willard Gardens. Willard Gardens is a relatively quiet, dead-end street, a mere 5-minute walk from the church. At the time that this video is being recorded in 2020, I am the 6th rector of this parish. And counting from the day of that first service held in the boardroom of the Bolt Works, it has been 134 years of history here at St. Olave's. These 134 years have seen many ups and downs, but here we are, continuing to move forward in faith and hope. We love our parish community, we love our building, and we love Swansea. And we look forward to the future, trusting that God will continue to bless us. Thank you for watching.